Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
What if twin flames do not truly reunite the moment they meet again, but in one exact inner moment that almost nobody recognizes? Not when the message arrives. Not when the silence ends. Not even when two people finally stand face to face again. Because the deepest reunion does not begin with contact. It begins with a shift in consciousness so subtle, so profound, that by the time it happens, the old version of love is already gone. So what is the exact moment twin flames reunite? Is it a conversation? A confession? A return? Or is it the moment both souls stop relating through pain and begin recognizing each other through truth? In this video, we're going to go deeply into the spiritual, emotional, and psychological moment where reunion really begins, and why most people miss it while they are still waiting for outer proof. Absolutely. Here is Chapter 1 in the same deep, emotionally layered YouTube narration style. Written long form in English. Chapter 1. Reunion is not what most people think. When most people imagine twin flame reunion, they imagine an event. A message. A phone call. A sudden return. A knock on the door. A confession. A meeting that finally ends the silence. They imagine the exact moment as something visible, something dramatic, something unmistakable, something that can be pointed to and said, "There, that was it. That was the moment we reunited." And on the surface, that makes sense. The human heart looks for form. The mind looks for proof. The nervous system looks for something concrete it can hold. So naturally, when people speak about reunion, they often speak about it as if it begins in the outer world. As if the moment of truth is the moment the separation ends physically. As if love becomes real only when it becomes visible. But what if that is not the deepest truth? What if twin flames do not truly reunite the moment they meet again, but in a much quieter moment that happens long before the outer world catches up? This is where the real mystery begins. Because the reunion most people are waiting for is often not the reunion the soul is preparing. The ego wants an event. The soul wants a transformation. And those are not the same thing. That difference is everything. Because two people can reconnect physically and still not be in true reunion. They can text again, speak again, even see each other again, and yet the old wounds are still in charge. The old patterns still dominate. The old fears still interpret everything. The same runner-chaser dynamic continues wearing new clothes. The same pain continues to move underneath the contact. So yes, they are back in communication. But are they truly reunited? That is a harder question. And on the other side, something even more mysterious can happen. Two people may still be physically apart, still not speaking, still not outwardly together. Yet on a deeper level, the true reunion may already have begun. How can that be? Because reunion, in its deepest sense, is not merely the ending of distance between two bodies. It is the ending of distortion between two souls. It is the moment when love stops passing primarily through fear. And that moment does not always announce itself with outer drama. Sometimes it happens in silence. Sometimes it happens in surrender. Sometimes it happens in a single internal shift so subtle that the mind almost misses it. A softening. A release. A collapse of resistance. A quiet knowing. A strange peace where there used to be panic. That may not look like reunion to the part of you that has been trained to expect romance as proof. But spiritually, psychologically, emotionally, it may be the most important moment of all. Because what most people call reunion is often only the visible consequence of a reunion that already happened invisibly. And this is why so many people misunderstand the journey. They are watching for the ending of silence. They are watching for the sign, the text, the return, the external confirmation. But the soul is watching for something else. Has the pattern changed? Has fear lost its throne? Has love become honest enough to stand without control? Has the old identity built around suffering finally begun to die? Because if those things have not happened, then outer contact alone cannot create sacred union. It can create another cycle, another opening, another wave of hope, another round of longing, confusion, and pain. But not yet true reunion. True reunion is not simply two people finding each other again. It is two people becoming able to meet without the same old distortions standing between them. That is why the exact moment is so often missed. It does not always feel like fireworks. In fact, one of the greatest paradoxes on the twin flame journey is this. The exact moment of reunion often feels less dramatic than the years of separation that came before. That sounds impossible to the ego. Because the ego expects the sacred to arrive as intensity. It expects tears, lightning, emotional overwhelm, signs everywhere, a cinematic breakthrough. It expects the exact moment to feel like the climax of a story. But the soul does not always work through climax. Sometimes it works through stillness. Stillness so deep that you almost mistake it for nothing happening. And yet everything is changing there. Imagine two tectonic plates beneath the earth. From the surface, nothing seems to move. The world looks the same. The sky does not split open. There is no obvious sign that anything is happening. And yet underneath, the entire landscape is rearranging itself. That is often what the real beginning of reunion feels like. Not loud. Foundational. Not theatrical. True. This is why we have to begin with a paradox. Reunion is not what most people think. Because what most people think is reunion is only the outer chapter, the visible reflection, the final echo, the event the human mind can recognize. But the real reunion begins earlier. It begins when something inside one's soul, and eventually both, can no longer relate through the old wound in the same way. It begins when the longing is no longer mixed with the same desperation. When the silence is no longer interpreted through total panic. When the fantasy begins to lose its hold. When control starts collapsing. When the need to chase truth into existence weakens. When love becomes less about possession and more about presence. That is the real threshold. And because it is internal, it is easy to overlook. The person waiting for the text may miss it. The person obsessing over timing may miss it. The person searching for dramatic signs may miss it. Why? Because the moment is too subtle for a mind addicted to intensity. You may not even recognize it at first. You may simply notice that something no longer hurts the way it used to. That you still care, but without the same fear. That the connection still matters, but it no longer owns your nervous system. That you are no longer begging reality to move in order for you to breathe. That shift may seem small. It is not. It is enormous. Because for the first time, love is beginning to separate itself from survival. And survival has shaped so much of the twin flame experience. Survival says, I need this to happen so I can feel okay. Survival says, I need reassurance, evidence, movement, confirmation. Survival says, if they return, then I will finally know that I matter. But the soul's version of reunion begins when that entire structure starts loosening. Not because love has grown weaker, but because love is becoming truer. This is where many people become frightened. Because when the old emotional intensity begins to shift, they think something is wrong. They think, why does this feel quieter? Why am I not panicking the same way? Why does the connection feel deeper, but less dramatic? Why does something in me feel settled before anything has outwardly changed? And the reason is simple, though not easy. The soul recognizes reunion before the ego can name it. That is why the beginning can feel almost invisible. The old self was looking for a scene. The deeper self is recognizing a frequency. And frequency changes before circumstances do. This is also why reunion is not simply a reward at the end of pain. It is not the trophy for suffering well. It is not proof that the years of confusion were justified by a romantic ending. It is something much more demanding than that. It is a state of truth. A state in which the bond is no longer being related to primarily through distortion, projection, or fear. a state in which inner resistance has weakened enough for real contact to mean something different than it meant before. A state in which two souls are no longer simply magnetized by wounding, but are beginning, however imperfectly, to recognize each other through clarity. That is why the first chapter of this journey must begin here. Because if you misunderstand what reunion is, you will misunderstand everything that leads to it. You will confuse contact with healing. You will confuse intensity with alignment. You will confuse longing with truth. You will confuse a reopened cycle with sacred union. And those confusions can keep people trapped for years. But once you understand that reunion is not merely an outer event, something changes. You begin looking deeper. You stop asking only, when will it happen? And you start asking, what is the state of love inside me now? That question changes everything. Because the exact moment twin flames reunite is not simply when a door opens in the outer world. It is when something closes in the inner one. The old panic. The old need to control. The old demand that love arrive in a certain form to be real. The old belief that suffering is the deepest proof of connection. When those things begin to die, reunion begins to breathe. Maybe softly. Maybe invisibly. Maybe long before a message ever arrives. But it begins. And that is why reunion is not what most people think. It is deeper than contact. Deeper than timing. Deeper than physical return. It is the exact moment when truth becomes stronger than distortion. And once that moment happens, the outer story may still take time to unfold, but the soul already knows. Something has changed. Not because the world has confirmed it yet, but because love is no longer moving through the same darkness as before. That is the real beginning. Not the event. The shift beneath it. And once you understand that, you are ready to go deeper into the question almost everyone asks, but very few truly understand. If reunion is not just the outer moment, then why do so many people misread it entirely? Send chapter 2 and I'll continue with why people misread reunion. Absolutely. Here is chapter 2 in the same deep, emotionally layered YouTube narration style. Chapter 2, why people misread reunion. One of the deepest reasons people misunderstand twin flame reunion is because they are looking for the wrong evidence. They are looking for movement in the outer world before they know how to recognize movement in the inner one. They are waiting for the text, the call, the apology, the return, the confession, the face-to-face moment that finally proves the story is real. And because of that, they often misread the entire journey. They think reunion begins when communication begins. They think reunion begins when distance ends. They think reunion begins when silence breaks. They think reunion begins when the other person comes back in a visible way. But visible return is not always true reunion. And silence is not always true separation. That is one of the hardest truths for the human heart to accept. Because the heart, especially when wounded, wants something concrete. It wants a scene it can point to. It wants a before and after. It wants a moment that feels undeniable. It wants proof that all the longing was leading somewhere real. And so it attaches itself to events. If they text, that must mean reunion is beginning. If they come back, that must mean union is here. If they speak lovingly, that must mean the connection has finally aligned. But is that really true? Not always. Two people can reconnect and still be carrying the exact same fears that pulled them apart. They can resume contact while still being governed by ego, by pain, by projection, by confusion, by nervous system dysregulation, by the old runner-chaser tension wearing a more sophisticated mask. They may call it reunion. But spiritually, psychologically, emotionally, they may simply be reopening the pattern. That happens more often than people realize. Because external movement is easier to recognize than internal transformation. A text is visible. A conversation is visible. A meeting is visible. But the death of fear? The softening of control? The collapse of old emotional dependency? The ending of inner resistance? Those things are harder to see. And yet they are often more important. This is why so many people misread reunion. They mistake contact for healing. But contact is not always healing. Sometimes contact only reveals what still has not healed. A person returns, and suddenly all the old triggers come alive again. The body becomes anxious. The mind becomes obsessed. The heart begins spiraling. Every message is overanalyzed. Every silence becomes loaded with fear. Every small inconsistency feels like emotional danger. So yes, the person came back. But did the energy truly change? That is the real question. Because if love still has to pass through panic in order to be experienced, if the bond still activates the same old abandonment wounds, if the same emotional script reappears the moment contact resumes, then what has really reunited? Bodies may be closer. Communication may be open. But consciousness may still be caught in the old cycle. And that is not the same as sacred reunion. This is why people often suffer even after getting the very thing they thought they wanted. They imagine that outer reunion would automatically bring peace. But instead, it brings exposure. Exposure of what is still reactive. Exposure of what is still unhealed. Exposure of how much of the longing was mixed with fantasy, fear, and unmet inner needs. That can be devastating. Because people often do not realize they were longing not only for the person, but for the version of reality they hoped the person would create inside them. Safety, validation, clarity, relief, wholeness, the end of questioning. And when outer contact fails to instantly create those things, confusion deepens. They think, but I thought this was reunion. I thought this would feel different. I thought if they came back, the pain would finally stop. But why would the pain stop if the inner structure receiving the love has not yet changed? That is the misunderstanding. People think reunion is an event. But reunion is also a capacity. The capacity to receive the connection without immediately filtering it through the old wound. The capacity to stay grounded when something shifts. The capacity to meet love without turning it into fear, pressure, or proof of worth. Without that capacity, outer movement can become another form of suffering. And on the other side, something even more mysterious happens, something that confuses people just as much. Sometimes true reunion begins inwardly long before anything obvious happens outside. And because nothing visible has changed, people assume nothing is happening. They assume silence means distance. Stillness means stagnation. No contact means no progress. No visible return means no reunion. But what if the most important part of reunion is happening beyond what the eyes can measure? What if one or both souls are already changing at the level that matters most? What if the old dynamic is already dying, even though the outer world has not yet caught up? What if the fear is weakening? What if the emotional dependency is dissolving? What if the inner masculine and feminine are reconciling? What if the soul is already becoming ready for a different kind of love? These things may not produce immediate external proof. But they are not nothing. In fact, they may be the deepest beginning of reunion itself. This is why silence is not always separation. Sometimes silence is reorganization. Sometimes silence is the space where old identities are losing power. Sometimes silence is the sacred pause in which the bond is no longer being fed by chaos, drama, or emotional overreach. Sometimes silence is where truth is gathering itself. But to recognize that, you have to stop measuring the connection only through visible behavior. And that is very hard. Because behavior is easier to understand than energy. Events are easier to understand than transformation. Outer signs are easier to trust than inner knowing. The ego loves what it can measure. Did they text or not? Did they come back or not? Did they choose me or not? Did something happen or not? But the soul asks different questions. Has the fear shifted? Has the old pattern weakened? Has love become cleaner? Has the attachment to control begun to die? Has something inside you stopped begging and started becoming still? Those are much quieter questions. And quieter questions lead to deeper truths. This is why people misread reunion so often. they confuse noise with movement. They assume that intense emotion means progress. They assume that dramatic events mean destiny is unfolding. They assume that if something feels big, it must be sacred. But not everything intense is aligned. Sometimes intensity is simply the nervous system reacting to unresolved pain. Sometimes the loudest stage of the journey is the least stable one. And sometimes the truest shift happens so quietly that only the soul notices at first. Think about that. What if the exact moment of reunion is so easily missed because it does not flatter the ego's need for spectacle? What if it feels less like fireworks and more like the end of inner warfare? Less like an explosion and more like a release. Less like a fantasy being fulfilled and more like a distortion finally losing its grip? That would explain why so many people overlook it. They are waiting to be overwhelmed. But truth often arrives by making you less overwhelmed. They are waiting for something dramatic. But what if the sacred becomes visible only after the drama starts dying? This is especially difficult for people who have spent years equating suffering with depth. Because if the connection no longer feels chaotic, they may think it is weakening. If they are no longer obsessing, they may think they care less. If the silence no longer destroys them, they may think the bond is fading. But what if the opposite is true? What if the reduction of chaos is not the loss of the connection, but the purification of it? That possibility changes everything. Because then reunion is no longer measured by how loudly the story is moving. It is measured by how truthfully love is able to exist. And that is a completely different lens. From that lens, a text is not automatically reunion. A return is not automatically union. A conversation is not automatically alignment. Likewise, no contact is not automatically failure. Silence is not automatically distance. Delay is not automatically rejection. Everything has to be seen more deeply, not only through what is happening, but through what is ending underneath it. Is fear ending? Is control ending? Is the old identity built around longing ending? Is the need for proof ending? Is the love becoming less mixed with panic? Those endings matter more than most outer beginnings. Because until those things shift, reunion is easily misread as they came back. But real reunion is not just a return. It is a new condition of being, a new way of meeting, a new way of loving, a new way of holding the connection without turning it into emotional survival. And that is why people misread it. They want the symbol. But the soul is creating the substance. The symbol may come later. A message, a meeting, a moment in the outer world that confirms something meaningful has changed. But if you only look for the symbol, you may miss the sacred work that made the symbol possible in the first place. And if you mistake the symbol for the whole truth, you may think reunion has happened when only contact has resumed. That distinction is essential. Because this journey is not teaching you how to recognize romantic events. It is teaching you how to recognize the difference between movement and transformation. That is much deeper. So if you have been measuring reunion only by what you can visibly see, pause. Ask yourself something harder. If the outer world changed tomorrow, would the inner world be ready to receive it differently? If the answer is not yet, then perhaps what you are longing for is not just the person. Perhaps you are longing for the exact inner shift that makes true reunion possible. And once that shift begins, something extraordinary happens. You stop misreading the journey. You stop worshiping appearances. You stop confusing contact with completion. You stop assuming silence means nothing sacred is happening. And you begin to understand a deeper truth. Reunion is not proven by movement alone. It is proven by what no longer stands between love and truth. Send chapter 3, and I'll continue with. The exact moment begins with the end of inner resistance. Absolutely. Here is chapter 3 in the same deep, emotionally layered YouTube narration style. Chapter 3. The exact moment begins with the end of inner resistance. If there is one hidden truth at the center of twin flame reunion, it is this. The exact moment does not begin when love suddenly appears. It begins when resistance finally stops fighting it. That is the moment almost nobody sees clearly. Because most people imagine reunion as something added to their life, a message, a return, a breakthrough, a visible shift in circumstances. They imagine it as an arrival. But at the deepest level, reunion often begins as a surrender. Not a surrender of love. Not a surrender of hope. Not a surrender that says, I no longer care. It is the surrender of struggle. The surrender of forcing. The surrender of inner warfare. The surrender of trying to control how, when, and in what form the sacred should arrive. And that is why this moment is so easy to miss. Because to the ego, surrender looks too quiet to be important. The ego wants movement. It wants proof. It wants measurable progress. It wants visible change. It wants something it can point to and say, now it's happening. But the soul is often watching for something else entirely. Has the inner fight ended? That is the real question. Because for so much of the twin flame journey, love is not only experienced as connection. It is experienced as tension. Tension between longing and fear. Tension between knowing and doubting. Tension between surrender and control. Tension between trusting divine timing and trying to manipulate it with signs, rituals, interpretations, fantasies, or emotional pressure. The heart says, I feel this is real. The mind says, then why is it not happening yet? The soul says, wait. The wounds say, no, do something. That inner split creates enormous suffering. And often, people do not realize that they are not only waiting for reunion. They are resisting reality the entire time. Resisting the silence. Resisting the timeline. Resisting uncertainty. Resisting the pain. Resisting their own helplessness. Resisting the truth that this love cannot be controlled into existence. That resistance becomes a kind of invisible wall. Not because love is absent, but because fear keeps trying to shape it into something manageable. This is why the exact moment of reunion begins with the end of inner resistance. Because love this deep cannot fully enter, where everything inside you is still bracing against what is. It is not that the soul is punishing you for struggling. It is that struggle itself distorts perception. When you are resisting, you cannot see clearly. When you are resisting, every delay feels personal. Every silence feels like rejection. Every sign becomes something to decode for reassurance. Every movement becomes charged with emotional survival. And in that state, even real love becomes difficult to receive. Why? Because the nervous system is not meeting the connection as love. It is meeting it as threat, hope, fear, urgency, and unfinished pain all at once. That is not peace. That is spiritual tension. And tension, no matter how sacred it seems, cannot hold the exact moment of true reunion for long. Because reunion is not just about desire. It is about receptivity. And receptivity only becomes possible when the inner war starts ending. That war can take many forms. It can look like obsessive thinking, like overanalyzing every sign, like needing constant reassurance from tarot, synchronicities, dreams, readers, or repeated external confirmation, like mentally rehearsing future conversations over and over, like trying to figure out divine timing, like swinging between intense faith and deep despair, like saying, I surrender, with your words while panic still runs your inner world. This is not said as criticism. It is said with compassion. Because many people on this path are not resisting because they are weak. They are resisting because they are terrified. Terrified of loss. Terrified of being wrong. Terrified that the love they feel so deeply may never take the form they hoped it would. Terrified that if they stop pushing internally, nothing will happen. So they keep gripping. Not always outwardly, but inwardly. And that grip becomes exhausting. At some point, the soul gets tired of being translated through fear. That is when something begins to change. Not always dramatically. Not always all at once. Sometimes the end of resistance begins as fatigue. You get tired of chasing. Tired of interpreting. Tired of suffering. Tired of trying to force meaning out of every sign. tired of trying to make silence speak faster than it is ready to. And at first, that fatigue can feel like defeat. You may think, maybe I'm losing faith. Maybe I don't care as much. Maybe I'm just too exhausted to keep believing. But sometimes that exhaustion is not the death of the bond. It is the death of struggle. And those are not the same thing. There is a sacred difference between giving up on love and giving up on your attempt to control it. One is despair. The other is surrender. Despair says, nothing matters anymore. Surrender says, I can no longer carry this through force. Despair collapses into hopelessness. Surrender opens into truth. This is why the exact moment often begins when something in you finally says, I cannot make this happen. I cannot think this into existence. I cannot prove it into reality. I cannot force divine timing to obey my pain. And strangely enough, that is not the end of power. It is the beginning of alignment. Because the moment you stop trying to bend the journey around your fear, you create space for truth to move differently. That space is holy. It may not feel exciting. It may not feel cinematic. In fact, it may feel almost empty at first. Because if your inner world has been driven by tension for a long time, the absence of tension can feel like nothing. But it is not nothing. It is a clearing. A clearing where love is no longer being strangled by urgency. A clearing where the soul can breathe without being constantly overruled by panic. A clearing where reality can begin to reveal itself without your wounds forcing every interpretation. Think of a lake that has been violently disturbed for years. The water has been whipped into movement by fear, longing, memory, hope, imagination, and emotional storms. You keep looking into the lake trying to see the truth of the connection, but the surface is always shaking, always distorted, always reacting. Then one day, the wind begins to die. The lake becomes still. At first, that stillness feels strange, almost unsettling. But gradually something becomes possible that was impossible before. You can finally see what is actually there. That is what the end of inner resistance does. It does not create truth. It reveals it. And often, what it reveals is shocking. Because once the struggle drops, you begin to realize how much of the journey was being filtered through fear of outcomes. Fear of abandonment. Fear of uncertainty. Fear of not being chosen. Fear of losing the story you had built around the connection. The love may still be there. The soul knowing may still be there. The bond may still be deeply alive. But now you are meeting it without so much interference. And that changes everything. The exact moment twin flames reunite often begins here. Not when one person suddenly appears, but when the inner architecture of resistance can no longer dominate the field of love. That does not mean all pain disappears instantly. It does not mean there are no more questions. It does not mean the outer world changes immediately. It does not mean every wound is fully healed in a single breath. But something irreversible begins. You stop fighting reality the same way. You stop demanding that uncertainty end before you can breathe. You stop needing constant emotional stimulation to feel connected. You stop trying to use signs as replacements for trust. You stop turning the connection into a problem your mind must solve. And once that happens, love begins to feel different. Quieter. Cleaner. Less frantic. More real. You may still deeply want the connection. But now the wanting is less entangled with panic. You may still feel the person strongly. But now the feeling is less mixed with compulsion. You may still long. But now the longing is less about escaping yourself and more about honoring something sacred. That shift is immense. Because it marks the end of one phase and the beginning of another. The phase of force begins dying. The phase of truth begins opening. And truth does not need to perform. It does not need to scream. It does not need to be constantly proven. It does not need to be emotionally dramatic in order to be real. This is why the exact moment is often not the outer event people expect. It is the inner cessation of resistance. The moment the soul is no longer being dragged by the ego's timeline. The moment the heart stops trying to protect itself through control. The moment the journey is no longer being related to mainly through fear. That is when something sacred clicks. Not loudly, but unmistakably. A deep release. A subtle inner yes. A soft but profound ending of the old fight. And from there, even if the outer world has not caught up yet, the frequency has changed. That matters more than most people understand. Because the outer reunion, when it comes, is not meant to be built on resistance. It is not meant to emerge out of panic, force, or internal warfare. It is meant to emerge from a field where truth has already become stronger than fear. That is why surrender is not passive on this path. It is active alignment. It is the brave refusal to keep turning love into struggle. So if you are in a place where something inside you feels less willing to fight, less willing to control, less willing to force clarity from mystery, do not mistake that for weakness. You may be entering the exact moment. The moment where the soul stops trying to drag reunion into form and begins allowing love to exist without so much resistance. That is not a small shift. That is the doorway. Because the exact moment twin flames reunite does not begin when the outer world finally says yes. It begins when the inner world stops saying no in 100 hidden ways. And when that happens, something extraordinary becomes possible. Love is no longer being held at the edge of your life by fear. It is finally being met by space. And in that space, reunion begins. Send chapter 4, and I'll continue with when the fear of loss no longer controls love. Absolutely. Here is chapter 4 in the same deep, emotionally layered YouTube narration style. Chapter 4. When the fear of loss no longer controls love. There is a point on the twin flame journey so subtle, so sacred, and so easily misunderstood that many people pass through it without realizing they are standing in one of the deepest thresholds of reunion. It is the moment when the fear of loss no longer controls love. Not the moment when fear disappears completely. Not the moment when all pain is gone forever. Not the moment when memory no longer aches, or when longing no longer exists in any form. But the moment when fear is no longer in charge of the way love moves through you. That is a profound difference. Because for much of the twin flame journey, love and fear are tangled together so tightly that people can no longer tell where one ends and the other begins. They say they love. And they do. But underneath that love is terror. Terror of losing the person. Terror of being forgotten. Terror of being replaced. Terror of being wrong about the connection. Terror of never reaching the ending they have built their soul around. So even the most sacred feelings become mixed with panic. The thought of them brings love and grief. The memory of them brings warmth and collapse. The signs bring hope and desperation. The silence brings longing and emotional survival mode. This is what makes the journey so intense. Because it is not only a love story. It is a confrontation with how much fear has been sitting inside love all along. And until that fear loosens its grip, true reunion cannot be deeply recognized. Why? Because fear changes the entire texture of the bond. Fear does not know how to simply love. Fear clings. Fear monitors. Fear prepares for loss before it happens. Fear turns every silence into prophecy. Fear turns every delay into rejection. Fear interprets mystery as danger. Fear tries to pull certainty out of the future because it cannot bear the vulnerability of the present. So even when the love is real, the experience of that love becomes distorted. It becomes heavy, hypervigilant, emotionally unstable, dependent on signs, outcomes, timing, and proof. And people often mistake that intensity for depth. They think, because I feel this so strongly, it must mean the love is at its highest. But strong feeling is not always pure feeling. Sometimes strong feeling is love filtered through fear of loss. That is one of the most painful truths on this path. Because it means the ache you thought was proof of sacredness may also be revealing the exact place where your heart is still wounded. And that wound changes everything. When fear of loss controls love, you do not simply love the person. You fear their absence more than you trust the connection. You fear silence more than you trust truth. You fear not being chosen more than you trust what your soul has learned. That kind of fear becomes a hidden ruler. You may still call it devotion. You may still call it spiritual longing. You may still call it deep knowing. But if fear controls the energy, then love is not yet free. And reunion cannot be fully recognized where love is still being managed by fear. This is why the exact moment often begins when something inside you changes in a way that is almost invisible from the outside. You still care. Deeply. You still feel the bond. You still know this connection has mattered in ways ordinary language cannot explain. But now something is different. You are no longer loving them through total panic. You are no longer collapsing every time the outer world goes quiet. You are no longer turning every possibility of loss into an emotional emergency. You still feel. But the feeling has become steadier. That steadiness is sacred. Because for the first time, love is no longer being asked to carry all the weight of your fear. This is not detachment in the cold sense. It is purification. The love remains. The fear begins losing power. And as simple as that sounds, it can feel deeply unsettling at first. Because many people have built their sense of connection around the intensity of fear. If they are afraid, they think it means they care. If they are suffering, they think it means the bond is alive. If they are obsessing, they think it means the soul is speaking loudly. So when the fear begins to soften, they become confused. Why am I calmer? Why am I not spiraling the same way? Why does their silence no longer destroy me? Why do I still love them, but not in the same frantic way? And the answer is not that the connection is weaker. It is that the love is becoming less contaminated by terror. That is one of the clearest signs of inner reunion. Because fear of loss is one of the deepest wounds that governs the twin flame path. It sits beneath the obsession, beneath the chasing, beneath the need for signs, beneath the longing for proof, beneath the pain of no contact, beneath the fantasy of the perfect reunion. At the core, so much of the suffering says, if I lose this, I lose something essential. And that belief creates enormous inner pressure. The person becomes more than a person. They become a symbol of destiny, a symbol of healing, a symbol of unfinished soul truth, a symbol of everything your heart fears it may never fully touch again. So naturally, fear becomes enormous. But the exact moment of reunion begins when love is no longer chained to that fear in the same way. Not because the connection matters less, but because your soul has grown strong enough to stop making loss the center of the story. That is maturity. Spiritual maturity. Emotional maturity. Soul maturity. The realization that love can remain true even when fear no longer dominates it. This changes the inner atmosphere of everything. You no longer scan every day for reassurance. You no longer feel the same need to control outcomes in your mind. You no longer interpret uncertainty as immediate emotional danger. You no longer hand all your inner stability over to the next sign, the next message, the next movement. Instead, something else begins to emerge. Presence. You can love without collapsing. You can feel without begging reality to move faster. You can remember without turning memory into torment. You can sense the bond without treating the possibility of loss as an apocalypse. This is what the ego rarely understands. It thinks love is proven by how devastated you become. But the soul knows something deeper. Love is proven by what remains true even when fear stops performing. That is a different kind of depth. A quieter depth. A cleaner depth. A more stable depth. And yes, it often feels less dramatic than what came before. But that does not make it smaller. It makes it real. Imagine holding water in trembling hands. No matter how pure the water is, the trembling distorts the experience of holding it. It spills. It shakes. It creates urgency and instability. You become more focused on not losing it than on actually receiving it. That is what fear does to love. It makes the heart so afraid of loss that it can barely experience the sacredness of what is there. But when the trembling begins to settle, something remarkable happens. the water does not become more sacred. You simply become more able to hold it. That is the exact shift this chapter is pointing toward. The moment when your love is no longer governed primarily by the fear of losing it. That does not mean you become emotionless. It means you become capable. Capable of holding truth without collapsing into survival mode. And that capability matters more than any outer event. Because if outer reunion happened while fear of loss still ruled your inner world, you would not experience reunion as peace. You would experience it as pressure. You would become afraid of every pause. Afraid of every inconsistency. Afraid of every change in tone, timing, or energy. Afraid that the very thing you waited for could disappear again. And so the love would remain trapped inside fear's architecture. That is not what sacred reunion is meant to be. Sacred reunion is not merely getting the person back. It is becoming able to meet the connection without fear constantly hijacking the experience. That is why this threshold matters so much. It marks the end of one way of loving and the beginning of another. The old way loved through terror. The new way loves through truth. The old way said, "If I lose you, I lose myself." The new way says, "I can love you deeply without losing my center." The old way said, "I need proof you are still here so I can survive." The new way says, "I trust what is true without needing constant emotional rescue." The old way said, "Fear keeps me connected." The new way says, "Fear only distorts what I am trying to feel clearly." That is the exact moment becoming visible. Not in the outer world first, but in the soul. When you stop loving through panic, the frequency changes. And often, the other soul feels that shift before anything visible happens. Why? Because fear has a texture. It presses. It grasps. It vibrates with urgency. But love without fear has a different texture. It allows. It steadies. It does not need to reach with the same desperation. It does not need to control in order to remain present. That shift changes the field of the connection. The old patterns lose some of their oxygen. The old reactions lose some of their authority. The bond begins to breathe in a different atmosphere. And that is often when real reunion starts becoming possible. Not because all wounds are gone. Not because both souls are suddenly perfect. But because love is no longer being entirely translated through the terror of losing itself. This is why the exact moment is so deep. It is not just a romantic moment. It is a spiritual emancipation. The heart is no longer being ruled by the threat of absence. The soul is no longer begging fear to give it permission to trust. The connection is no longer measured only by how much pain it can produce. That is freedom. A quiet freedom. A mature freedom. A sacred freedom. And from that freedom, the bond can begin to take a different form. So if you are in a phase where you still love deeply, but the fear is losing its grip if you still feel the connection, but you are no longer being torn apart by every silence if something in you has become calmer, steadier, less desperate, even though the journey still matters profoundly. Do not mistake that for disconnection. You may be standing in one of the most important moments of all. The moment when love is no longer ruled by fear of loss. And that is not the end of passion. It is the beginning of truth. Because twin flames do not truly reunite when fear becomes louder than love. They reunite in the exact moment love becomes stronger than the fear of losing it. And once that happens, something subtle but irreversible begins. The soul no longer needs suffering in the same way to recognize what is sacred. It simply knows. And from that knowing, reunion moves closer, not as fantasy, not as panic, but as a truth that can finally be held without trembling in the same old way. Send chapter 5, and I'll continue with the death of the old dynamic. Absolutely. Here is chapter 5 in the same deep, emotionally layered YouTube narration style. Chapter 5, the death of the old dynamic. There is a moment on the twin flame journey that feels less like reunion at first and more like collapse. Not the collapse of the bond, the collapse of the pattern. And for many people, this is one of the most confusing stages of all, because the old dynamic often dies before the new reality is visible. So instead of feeling like progress, it can feel like emptiness, disorientation, even loss. Why? Because most twin flame connections do not begin in peace. They begin in intensity. An intensity that awakens, destabilizes, magnetizes, wounds, reveals, and transforms. And within that intensity, a pattern often forms, one that becomes so familiar that people mistake it for the connection itself. One reaches. One withdraws. One waits. One avoids. One overfeels. One suppresses. One chases meaning. One runs from it. And over time, that dynamic becomes more than behavior. It becomes identity. The chaser begins to believe, I am the one who feels this more deeply. I am the one carrying the bond. I am the one who stays loyal in the silence. I am the one who knows what this is. And the runner, whether consciously or not, begins to live inside another identity. I am the one who cannot face this. I am the one who needs distance to survive. I am the one who must keep control by not fully yielding. Both roles are painful, but they are also familiar. And the familiar has power, even when it is hurting you. That is why the exact moment of reunion often requires something that feels almost terrifying to the ego. The old dynamic has to die. Not be softened a little. Not be romanticized. Not be renamed while secretly continuing underneath. D. Because reunion is not the return of the old cycle in a prettier form. It is the end of the cycle itself. That is the part many people resist. They think they want reunion, but what they often still want, at least at first, is the old emotional script to finally resolve in their favor. They want the same dynamic, but with a better ending. The same pattern, but this time with closure. The same longing, but finally rewarded. The same chase, but this time the runner turns around. But sacred union cannot be built on an unresolved pattern finally getting its moment. It requires the pattern to lose its power altogether. That is why the death of the old dynamic is so profound. It is not just that the behavior changes. It is that the energy feeding the behavior begins to disappear. The chaser no longer wants to chase in the same way. The reaching starts to feel exhausting. The overthinking starts to feel hollow. The constant decoding starts to feel like self-abandonment rather than devotion. The old hunger for signs loses some of its grip. And at first, this can feel deeply unsettling. Because if you are not chasing anymore, who are you? If you are not organizing your emotional life around the person, the timing, the signs, the pain, the hope, the next possible movement, then what remains? This is why people often misread the death of the old dynamic as loss of connection. They think, why am I less reactive? Why do I no longer want to check everything? Why am I not being pulled into the same emotional spiral? Have I become numb? Have I stopped caring? But that is not always numbness. Sometimes it is truth stripping away performance. Sometimes it is the soul refusing to keep expressing love through a wound. Because as long as the old dynamic survives, the bond is still moving through trauma pattern roles. One fears abandonment, so they move toward. One fears engulfment, so they move away. One seeks reassurance. One seeks distance. One makes the connection louder. One makes it more silent. And both people remain trapped in a dance that feels fated, but is still governed by pain. Can two souls truly reunite while still hiding inside the exact wounds that separated them? That is the real question. And the answer, at the deepest level, is no. They may reconnect. They may reappear in each other's lives. They may reopen the story. But if the old dynamic is still alive in the same form, then the connection is not yet free. It is still looping. That is why the exact moment twin flames reunite is inseparable from the death of the old pattern. Because reunion is not simply distance ending. It is distortion ending. And distortion lives inside the pattern. The pattern says, I need you to act a certain way for me to feel safe. I need to pursue because that is the only way I know how to love. I need to withdraw because that is the only way I know how to protect myself. I need the tension because without it, I do not know how to feel the bond. But none of that is real union. It is emotional architecture built around fear. And the soul gets tired of living there. At some point, something inside begins refusing the old script. The chaser gets tired of making longing an identity. The runner gets tired of making distance a shield. The connection itself begins rejecting the old way it has been carried. And this creates a strange, sacred emptiness. Because when the pattern dies, there is often a period where nothing feels familiar. The old intensity fades. The old reactions weaken. The old emotional roles stop providing the same structure. And for a while, there is just space. That space can feel almost unbearable. Because humans are more accustomed to pattern than truth. Pattern gives you something to do. Truth gives you something to face. Pattern says, repeat what you know. Truth says, become someone new. That is why the death of the old dynamic can feel like mourning. You are not only grieving the person. You are grieving the version of yourself that lived inside the cycle. The one who knew how to wait. The one who knew how to ache. The one who knew how to interpret silence. The one who knew how to feel important through suffering. The one who made devotion out of emotional overextension. And on the other side, the runner is also grieving something, whether consciously or not. The old protection no longer works. Distance no longer creates the same illusion of freedom. Avoidance no longer fully numbs what the soul is asking to be felt. The role of the one who escapes begins losing its stability. That is why this stage can be so quiet externally and so enormous internally. Because the death of the old dynamic is not always visible. It can happen beneath the surface first. The chaser stops feeding the loop energetically. The runner starts feeling the collapse of their old defenses internally. The emotional choreography no longer works the same way. And once that choreography weakens, something unprecedented becomes possible. For the first time, the connection is no longer being carried entirely by imbalance. That matters more than most people realize. Because imbalance can generate intensity. But it cannot sustain sacred union. Sacred union needs something else. Mutual presence. Not perfect presence. Not instant maturity. Not total healing overnight. But enough truth that one person is no longer performing love through pursuit while the other performs safety through absence. That shift is enormous. And yet, ironically, it often feels less exciting than the old cycle. Why? Because the ego is stimulated by drama. Drama feels alive. Drama feels meaningful. Drama feels like something is happening. But when the old dynamic dies, the drama begins losing oxygen. And what replaces it, at first, is not fireworks. It is stillness. Stillness where there used to be panic. Stillness where there used to be overanalysis. Stillness where there used to be chasing and resisting. This can feel anticlimactic to the wounded self. But to the soul, it is holy. Because for the first time, love is no longer being forced to express itself through old survival strategies. It is being given room to breathe differently. That is what the death of the old dynamic really is. The end of confusing pain with proof. The end of confusing pursuit with devotion. The end of confusing withdrawal with power. The end of confusing emotional volatility with spiritual depth. And until those confusions begin to die, reunion cannot be deeply understood. Because true reunion does not happen when the old dance becomes temporarily softer. It happens when the dancers no longer need the old steps. That is the shift. The chaser no longer needs suffering to feel connected. The runner no longer needs distance to feel safe. The bond no longer needs tension to feel alive. When that begins to happen, something extraordinary starts opening. The energy becomes less theatrical, but more real. Less chaotic, but more grounded. Less addictive, but more honest. And that honesty is what makes union possible. Not fantasy. Not chemistry alone. Not pain prolonged until it magically becomes wisdom. Honesty. The honesty to see the old dynamic for what it was. The honesty to stop calling dysfunction destiny. the honesty to admit that what once felt sacred was also deeply entangled with fear. The honesty to let the whole structure fall apart rather than keep worshiping it because it felt intense. That is courage. And that courage is part of the exact moment. Because twin flames do not reunite merely when they find each other again. They reunite when the old pattern can no longer define the meeting. So if you are in a stage where the old emotional script feels like it is dying, if the urge to chase feels weaker, if the old cycle feels exhausted, if something in you no longer wants to participate in the same pain, even though the connection still matters deeply, do not panic. You are not necessarily losing the bond. You may be losing the distortion that once carried it. And that loss, however strange it feels, is sacred. Because the death of the old dynamic is not the end of the story. It is the end of the version of the story that could never become real union. And only when that version dies can something truer begin. Send chapter 6, and I'll continue with the sacred recognition. I no longer need you to complete me. Absolutely. Here is chapter 6 in the same deep, emotionally layered YouTube narration style. Chapter 6, the sacred recognition. I no longer need you to complete me. There is a moment on the twin flame journey that changes the entire meaning of reunion. It is not always dramatic. It is not always visible. It is not always marked by a message, a confession, or a physical return. Sometimes it happens in complete silence. Sometimes it happens in the privacy of your own soul, where no one else can see it. And yet, when it happens, it alters everything. It is the sacred recognition. I no longer need you to complete me. But now I can truly meet you. That is one of the deepest and most shocking moments before real reunion. Because for so much of the twin flame journey, the bond is experienced through need. Need for contact. Need for reassurance. Need for closure. Need for recognition. Need for the person to return in order to settle the chaos inside you. Need for the relationship to become visible, so the soul no longer feels suspended between hope and pain. And this need is understandable. When a connection reaches that deeply into the heart, it does not feel casual. It does not feel optional. It feels like something essential has been touched, something ancient, something unfinished, something sacred. So naturally, the person can begin to feel like more than a person. They become the symbol of the answer, the symbol of home, the symbol of wholeness, the symbol of the part of you that feels missing. And that is where the illusion quietly forms. Because once the person becomes the symbol of what is missing, you are no longer just loving them. You are needing them to restore something in you. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Love can be sacred, but need mixed with love can become desperate. And desperation changes the frequency of the entire bond. It makes every silence heavier, every delay more painful, every sign more loaded, every possibility of reunion more emotionally overwhelming. Why? Because if they are the one who completes you, then their absence does not just feel sad. It feels existential. It feels like something essential is missing from your soul. It feels like life is paused. It feels like breath itself has become conditional. And that is why so many people suffer so deeply on this path. Not only because they love, but because they have unconsciously attached their wholeness to the return of another person. This is what the soul eventually has to dismantle. Not the love, the dependency, not the sacredness of the bond. The illusion that the bond exists to fill your inner emptiness for you. That illusion is powerful because it does not always look unhealthy at first. In spiritual language, it can even sound beautiful. They are my other half. They are the missing piece. They complete my soul. I am incomplete without them. These phrases feel romantic because they speak to the intensity of the connection. But spiritually and psychologically, they can become dangerous when taken literally. Because the moment you believe someone completes you, you hand your inner center over to their presence, their choices, their readiness, their timing, and their wounds. And then love becomes entangled with emotional captivity. That is not sacred union. That is fragmentation waiting to be soothed from the outside. The exact moment of deeper reunion begins when that illusion starts dying. And when it dies, it can feel like grief. Because part of you wanted it to be true. Part of you wanted them to be the answer. Part of you wanted reunion to be the moment all inner separation finally disappeared without, requiring you to become whole within yourself first. So when the soul begins whispering, they are not here to complete you, it can feel devastating. At first, it may even feel like a loss of magic. Because if they are not the missing piece, then what are they? If the connection is not here to rescue your sense of incompleteness, then why is it so deep? The answer is more sacred than fantasy ever was. They are not the one who completes you. They are the one who reveals where you have not yet become whole. That is very different. One idea keeps you dependent. The other calls you into transformation. One says, wait for them to return so you can finally be enough. The other says, become enough within yourself so love no longer has to carry the burden of your fragmentation. That is the sacred recognition. And it does not make the bond less meaningful. It makes it more real. Because now, for the first time, you are no longer approaching reunion as emotional rescue. You are approaching it as truth. This is one of the holiest shifts on the journey. You still love them. Deeply. You may still feel that they are significant in ways words cannot explain. You may still sense the soul-level nature of the connection. You may still believe that something unfinished, something sacred, something deeply transformative exists between you. But now something fundamental has changed. You are no longer asking them to be the missing half of your being. You are no longer asking their return to fix the parts of you that your own soul is trying to gather back into wholeness. That changes the entire emotional atmosphere of the bond. Before, love may have sounded like this. I need you to choose me so I can feel safe. I need you to come back so I can feel whole. I need this reunion so I can finally stop hurting. I need your presence to resolve what your absence exposed. But now love begins to sound different. I can feel this bond without losing myself inside it. I can honor what this connection is without turning it into the source of my worth. I can want you deeply without needing you to repair my soul for me. I can meet you as a whole being, not as a wound searching for completion. That is the exact inner click. And it is far more powerful than most outward signs. Because this is the moment when dependency begins transforming into devotion. And those two things are not the same. Dependency says, I need you so I can be okay. Devotion says, I honor what this is, but I remain rooted in my own soul. Dependency trembles. Devotion steadies. Dependency fears loss constantly. Devotion can remain present even in uncertainty. Dependency turns love into survival. Devotion turns love into truth. That is why this chapter matters so much. Because many people think reunion is about getting closer to the other person. But at the deepest level, reunion becomes possible when you stop needing the other person to fill the distance within yourself. That inner distance is what the journey exposes so painfully. The abandoned places inside you. The unloved places. The fragmented parts. The wounded masculine and feminine energies within. The younger self still waiting to be chosen. The part of you that learned to believe love must come from outside in order to make life meaningful. All of that rises to the surface through the twin flame connection. And for a long time, it is easy to believe the answer is external reunion. But eventually, the soul reveals something deeper. The external reunion cannot carry the whole burden of what your inner self is asking to heal. That is why the sacred recognition is not cold detachment. It is not a rejection of love. It is a refinement of love. A cleansing of it. A stripping away of all the layers that said, I need you to save me. And what remains after that stripping is often quieter, but infinitely more powerful. Because now, if reunion happens, it is no longer one wounded self asking another wounded self to create wholeness. It is one soul meeting another from a place of greater integrity. That is sacred. And ironically, it is often the very shift that allows outer reunion to become possible. Why? Because need creates pressure, and pressure distorts the field of love. Need says, "Come to me so I can stop hurting." But truth says, "I have stopped making you responsible for my inner completion." That truth changes the frequency profoundly. There is less grasping, less emotional urgency, less symbolic burden placed on the other person, less fantasy, less control. And where there is less pressure, there is more room for reality. That is when the connection can breathe differently. Not as addiction, not as idealization, not as longing trying to become identity, but as resonance. Two whole beings recognizing something sacred in one another. That does not mean the journey becomes emotionless. It does not mean you stop caring. It does not mean longing vanishes overnight. It means the center of gravity changes. Before, your center was in them. Now your center begins returning to you. And from that center, you can finally meet the connection without needing it to substitute for your own inner wholeness. That is why this recognition feels both humbling and liberating. Humbling, because it forces you to admit how much of your longing was mixed with unmet needs. Liberating, because now love no longer has to carry all that weight. And the soul can finally breathe. Imagine two people meeting while both are drowning. They may love each other deeply, but the meeting will still be chaotic, desperate, unstable. Each one may reach for the other not only out of love, but out of survival. Now imagine one of them learning how to stand on solid ground. They do not stop caring. They do not stop feeling. But now, if they reach from groundedness instead of panic. That is the shift. And sacred reunion requires that shift. Because real union is not about one incomplete being finding its missing half. It is about two souls becoming capable of meeting without using love as a substitute for inner integration. That is the exact moment maturing in real time. You no longer need them to complete you. And because you no longer need that, you can finally love them more truthfully. Without turning them into a savior. Without turning reunion into salvation. Without turning the bond into an answer for every wound you have not yet learned to hold within yourself. This is the beginning of sacred maturity. The moment when the heart says, "I still feel you. I still honor this. I still know there is something real here. But I no longer need you to become whole. I am learning to meet that wholeness within myself. And from there I can truly meet you." That is not less love. That is love freed from illusion. And once that happens, the bond changes. Not because the soul suddenly becomes less connected, but because the connection is no longer being forced to carry what belonged to your own healing all along. That is why this is one of the deepest thresholds of reunion. Because from here forward, love is no longer being approached through lack. It is being approached through truth. And truth is the only place where sacred union can truly begin. Send chapter 7, and I'll continue with why reunion often feels quiet, not explosive. Absolutely. Here is chapter 7 in the same deep, emotionally layered YouTube narration style. Chapter 7. Why reunion often feels quiet, not explosive. One of the greatest misunderstandings about twin flame reunion is this. People expect the exact moment to feel explosive. They expect intensity. Fireworks. Tears. A sudden rush of certainty. A dramatic turning point that feels impossible to miss. They imagine the moment of reunion as something cinematic. Something that arrives with emotional force so powerful that it erases all doubt instantly. Something overwhelming enough to match the years of longing, pain, silence. An inner transformation that came before it. And on a human level, that makes sense. After so much suffering, the heart wants a climax. After so much confusion, the mind wants a moment that explains everything. After so much waiting, the nervous system wants something undeniable. But the deeper truth is far more surprising. Very often, the exact moment twin flames reunite does not feel explosive. It feels quiet. Not empty. Not weak. Not lifeless. Quiet. And because it feels quiet, many people miss it. They miss it because they have spent so long associating intensity with truth that peace feels underwhelming by comparison. They have lived in longing, signs, psychic pulls, emotional surges, fantasy, fear, hope, despair, obsession, and sacred exhaustion for so long that when the real shift begins, it can feel almost too still to be important. But what if stillness is the very sign that something real has changed? That is the question this chapter asks. Because intensity and truth are not the same thing. Intensity can come from trauma. Intensity can come from uncertainty. Intensity can come from the nervous system trying to survive the unknown. Intensity can come from fear, projection, fantasy, and emotional dependency. And yes, intensity can also appear in sacred love. But sacred love is not proven by how loud it becomes. Sometimes it is proven by how much noise disappears when distortion begins to die. That is why reunion often feels quiet. Because what people usually call explosive is often the old pattern reacting. The old self feels overwhelmed. The old wounds light up. The old hope surges. The old fear screams. The old emotional body demands an event big enough to justify the pain it has carried. But the exact moment of reunion happens when the old emotional architecture is no longer running the connection in the same way. And when that architecture begins to fall, the atmosphere changes. It becomes calmer, cleaner, more grounded, more direct. That may not feel as exciting to the ego, but to the soul, it feels unmistakable. Think about it. If the exact moment truly marks the ending of distortion, why would it feel chaotic? If reunion is the moment when fear loosens, when old patterns die, when love is no longer passing through panic in the same way, then of course it may feel less dramatic than the years that came before it. Because what is ending is drama itself. That is the paradox. The journey before the exact moment is often explosive because so much is unresolved. The soul is awakening, but the wounds are still active. The connection is real, but the inner world is still unstable. There is truth, but there is also fear. There is knowing, but there is also control. There is love, but there is also need. All of that creates emotional weather. Storms, highs and lows, confusion and revelation, signs and silence, pull and retreat. So naturally, people become conditioned to believe that the sacred will continue arriving through emotional intensity. But what happens when the sacred no longer needs to use pain to get your attention? What happens when the soul has finally become quiet enough to receive truth without being shattered by it? That is often the exact moment. And it may feel more like peace than passion. Not because passion is gone, but because passion is no longer fused with panic. This distinction is everything. There is a version of passion that burns through fear. And there is a version of love that glows through peace. The first one feels thrilling, but unstable. The second one may feel less dramatic, but infinitely more real. Many people do not trust that second state at first. Why? Because peace can feel unfamiliar when the nervous system has been trained by chaos. If you have lived for a long time in an emotional cycle where love always came with adrenaline, then calm can feel suspicious. It can feel like the absence of feeling. It can feel like detachment. It can feel like something is missing. You may even ask yourself, why am I not spiraling? Why am I not obsessing the same way? Why does this feel clearer, but less overwhelming? Why does something in me just know, instead of needing to react? And the answer may be simple, though deeply transformative. Because the exact moment is not always a peak. Sometimes it is a release. A release from fighting. A release from needing the next sign to survive. A release from the old emotional urgency. A release from confusing suffering with depth. That release can feel strangely ordinary at first. Almost too ordinary. You may still feel the person deeply. You may still sense something sacred unfolding. You may even notice outer shifts beginning. But your inner state is different. You are not erupting. You are not collapsing. You are not begging reality to explain itself immediately. You are simply present. And presence is one of the clearest signs that reunion is no longer being filtered through the same wounds. This is why the exact moment often feels like a quiet certainty rather than an emotional explosion. Not certainty in the egoic sense, not a need to know every outcome, every timeline, every detail, but certainty in the soul's sense. A wordless knowing, a settled feeling, a sense that something has already changed, even if the outer world is still catching up. That kind of certainty does not shout. It rests. And because it rests, the ego may overlook it. The ego says, this cannot be it. It's too calm, too simple, too quiet. The soul says, exactly. Because truth rarely needs performance. Fantasy does. Fear does. Projection does. Unhealed longing does. But truth does not. Truth can arrive in stillness and remain no less profound. Imagine sunrise. Most people focus on the dramatic moment when the sun becomes visible above the horizon. But the true change began earlier, in near silence. A subtle shift in color. A softening of darkness. A quiet rearrangement of light so gradual that if you were impatient, you might miss the miracle entirely. That is how the exact moment often feels. Not like a sudden explosion in the sky. More like the darkness losing its authority. And that loss of darkness is quiet. Quiet enough that only a soul trained by suffering would mistake it for nothing. But it is not nothing. It is a sacred rearrangement. The fear is no longer leading. The old pattern is no longer feeding itself. The need to complete yourself through the other person is no longer dominating your love. The bond is being felt through more truth than distortion. Of course that feels quieter. There is less internal friction now. Less resistance. Less chasing. Less panic. Less emotional noise. And when friction disappears, the soul does not always become louder. Sometimes it becomes clearer. That is a huge difference. Because clarity is not as intoxicating as intensity. But it is far more trustworthy. Intensity can convince you something is happening. Clarity lets you recognize what is actually real. That is why the exact moment may feel less like a movie scene and more like a moment of deep inner stillness. You stop reaching so hard. You stop doubting every silence. You stop needing to manufacture hope. You stop interpreting everything through terror. And in that softening, something sacred becomes undeniable. Not because it overwhelms you, but because it no longer has to. This is also why actual outer contact, if it follows, may feel different than expected. You may have imagined a dramatic reunion full of emotional chaos and intense declarations. But when the exact moment has already happened inwardly, the outer expression may come in a calmer form. A simple message, a quiet conversation, a natural opening, a clear exchange without the old heaviness. And that can shock people, because they expected the return to feel explosive. But instead it feels clean. They expected emotional fireworks. But instead they feel grounded. They expected to lose themselves in the moment. But instead they remain strangely centered. That centeredness is not a lack of love. It is the proof that love is no longer entering through the old wound. And that is why reunion often feels quiet. Not because it is small, but because what is holy does not always need to arrive as spectacle. Sometimes it arrives as peace so unfamiliar that the wounded self almost does not know how to trust it. Sometimes it arrives as the end of drama, not the reward of it. Sometimes it arrives as stillness so deep that the soul recognizes it before the mind can explain it. So if you are waiting for the exact moment to feel explosive, ask yourself a deeper question. What if the most sacred shift would not need to overwhelm you at all? What if it would feel like relief? Like settling? Like truth no longer arguing with itself inside you? Like the strange realization that you are no longer trying to force what once consumed you? That may be closer to the exact moment than any fantasy ever was. Because reunion is not here to create one final emotional storm. It is here to end the need for storms as proof of love. And when that ending begins, it may not flatter the ego's hunger for spectacle. But it will bring something much more valuable. Peace that does not need to prove itself. Clarity that does not need to shout. Love that no longer depends on suffering to feel real. That is the quiet power of the exact moment. And once you understand that, you are ready to see how the outer world begins reflecting the inner reunion that has already started. Send chapter 8, and I'll continue with. The outer world reflects the inner reunion. Absolutely. Here is chapter 8 in the same deep, emotionally layered YouTube narration style. Chapter 8. The outer world reflects the inner reunion. There comes a point on the twin flame journey when the outer world begins to move differently. Not always dramatically. Not always all at once. Not always in the cinematic way the wounded heart once imagined. But differently. And that difference matters. Because once the inner reunion begins, once fear loosens, once the old pattern starts dying, once love is no longer being filtered through the same desperation, the outer world often begins to respond. Not as magic in the childish sense. Not as instant reward. Not as proof that the universe has finally decided to be kind. But as reflection. That is the deeper law at work here. The outer world does not create the reunion. It echoes it. It mirrors it. It responds to it. It gives form to something that has already begun in the invisible layers first. This is what so many people misunderstand. They think outer change is the cause. The message caused the shift. The meeting caused the reunion. The communication caused the peace. The return caused the alignment. But often at the deepest level, the opposite is true. The peace came first. The alignment came first. The inner shift came first. And then, slowly, reality began arranging itself around what had already become possible within. This is why the outer world reflecting the inner reunion feels so different from the old cycle. In the old cycle, outer signs often brought turmoil. A text would cause spiraling. A dream would trigger obsession. A synchronicity would create urgency. A social media post would awaken fear and overanalysis. A brief contact would reopen emotional chaos instead of settling it. Why? Because the inner world was still unstable. So every outer event was being received through the old architecture of fear, longing, and nervous system activation. But when inner reunion begins, something changes in the way outer reality lands inside you. A message may come, but it does not destroy your center. A chance encounter may happen, but it does not pull you back into emotional survival mode. A shift in communication may begin, but instead of panic, you feel clarity. A sign may appear, but instead of needing it to save you, you simply notice it. That difference is enormous. Because now the outer world is no longer feeding the old wound. It is reflecting a new state of being. And that is one of the clearest indicators that reunion is no longer just fantasy. It is becoming embodied. The outer world often reflects the inner reunion in subtle ways first. A softening in timing. A dissolving of obstacles. A sense that what once felt blocked now feels strangely open. A conversation that happens more naturally than expected. An exchange that feels simple, but carries a completely different emotional atmosphere than before. This is what surprises many people. Because they expect outer reunion to look dramatic. But often, when the inner work has truly ripened, the outer movement feels almost ordinary on the surface. A text that is simple, but energetically clean. A meeting that is quiet, but deeply different. A return that does not feel like a storm, but like something settling into place. And that can be confusing to the ego. The ego says, that's it. After all this pain, shouldn't it feel bigger? Shouldn't there be more intensity, more tears, more overwhelming emotion? But the soul knows why it feels different. Because this is not the old pattern reactivating. This is a new frequency expressing itself. And new frequency often looks less dramatic than old distortion. This is where many people miss how sacred the outer reflections really are. They are still waiting for a symbol grand enough to match the fantasy. But the soul is often showing them something much more meaningful. Not spectacle. Stability. Not emotional fireworks. Congruence. not an overwhelming external event. A visible mirror of an invisible shift that has already matured inside. Think of it like this. For a long time, the connection may have felt like lightning, unpredictable, electric, intense, impossible to hold steadily. But once the inner reunion begins, the outer world may stop behaving like lightning and start behaving more like dawn. Gradual, clean, natural, undeniable, but not violent. That does not make it less profound. It makes it more real. Because lightning is dramatic, but brief. Dawn changes the whole landscape. That is the difference between outer events that reopen the cycle and outer reflections that emerge from true inner transformation. One excites the wound. The other confirms the shift. And this is why the outer world often begins moving after the inner state becomes more stable. Not because the universe is testing you cruelly until you get it right, but because what can be sustained externally is deeply connected to what has been built internally. If the inner world still interprets everything through fear, then outer movement may only create more confusion. But when inner truth becomes stronger than old panic, outer movement can finally land in a space capable of receiving it differently. That is what makes reflection possible. The outer world begins to match the new signal. And this can happen in many forms. Communication may reopen. Synchronicities may return in a cleaner, less chaotic way. Circumstances that once kept both people apart may begin shifting. Timing may no longer feel so tortured. The connection may stop feeling like a wound that constantly bleeds and start feeling like something coherent, even before it is fully visible. Sometimes the reflection is even more subtle than that. Sometimes what changes first is not what happens, but how it feels. The silence feels different. The distance feels different. The energy between you feels different. The absence of contact no longer feels like total separation. The possibility of movement no longer feels impossible. And that shift in felt reality is not imaginary. It is often the outer field responding to what has changed within you. Because the connection is not only a sequence of events. It is a field. A living field shaped by consciousness, fear, surrender, readiness, and truth. And when the consciousness within that field changes, the outer experience of the field changes too. That is why reunion does not begin with a physical event. The event is only the visible tip of something much deeper. The outer world reflects what the soul has already become capable of holding. This is also why some messages feel different than others. Earlier in the journey, contact may have activated chaos. Now, contact may feel strangely grounded. Earlier, a sign may have caused obsession. Now, a sign may simply confirm what your soul already knows quietly. Earlier, a return may have reopened pain. Now, even a small gesture may carry a sense of calm, readiness, or emotional honesty that was absent before. The surface may not always look huge, but the energetic meaning is enormous. Because when the outer world reflects the inner reunion, the reflection carries less distortion, less pressure, less symbolic burden, less need for the moment to save you, less fantasy forcing reality to become something it is not. Instead, what emerges feels simpler. And simplicity is something the ego often underestimates. The ego likes complexity because complexity feels important. But truth often becomes simple once the inner noise begins clearing. A message is just a message. A meeting is just a meeting. A conversation is just a conversation. And yet, because the inner world has changed, each of those things now contains something that was missing before. Space. Space for honesty. Space for presence. Space for the connection to exist without instantly being swallowed by the old wound. That space is sacred. Because sacred union is not made real by how intense the outer event feels. It is made real by whether the event can now be received without collapsing back into the old pattern. That is the test. Not, did it happen dramatically enough? But, can it now happen truthfully enough? That question goes deeper than romance. Because the outer reflection is not just giving you what you wanted. It is revealing who you have become. a calmer soul, a steadier heart, a less reactive nervous system. A person no longer asking each outer sign to complete an inner fracture. That is why the outer world reflecting the inner reunion is so meaningful. It is not just about them reaching out. It is about the fact that if they do, you can now meet it as someone different. And that difference may be the most important sign of all. The old you might have turned a text into an emotional collapse. The emerging you can turn it into a moment of presence. The old you might have treated a reunion as the final answer to pain. The emerging you can meet it as an unfolding truth, without demanding that it erase everything instantly. The old you needed the outer world to prove the connection. The emerging you has already begun embodying the reunion within. And because of that, the outer world no longer needs to shout. It can whisper. It can move in smaller, cleaner ways. It can unfold more naturally. It can reflect what has matured rather than compensating for what is still broken. This is why physical reunion, when it comes from true inner readiness, may feel unexpectedly human. Not superhuman. Not mythic. Not unbearably overwhelming. Just deeply real. A conversation that lands cleanly. A gaze that feels settled instead of destabilizing. A presence that no longer feels like something you must chase, hold, or decode in order to survive. That is a holy shift. Because what is being reflected is not just contact. It is coherence. The inner and outer world beginning, finally, to speak the same language. So if you are noticing quiet movement in the outer world, if things feel less blocked, less dramatic, less distorted, if signs or contact feel cleaner, simpler, more grounded than before, do not dismiss that just because it is not explosive. Sometimes the most sacred outer changes are the ones that do not need to arrive as crisis. Sometimes the physical reunion is only the mirror of a soul reunion that has already happened. And if that is true, then the most important thing is not simply whether the outer world has moved yet. It is whether you can recognize the reflection when it begins. Because the outer world will always express itself according to the depth of what has become possible within. And when inner reunion is real, outer reality eventually has less and less reason to keep repeating the old distortion. That is when life begins showing you, gently but unmistakably, what changed inside you was never only personal. It changed the entire field. And from that field, the next chapter of reunion can finally begin to take form. Send chapter 9, and I'll continue with the deep truth. The exact moment is when love stops passing through the ego. Absolutely. Here is chapter 9 in the same deep, emotionally layered YouTube narration style. Chapter 9, the deep truth. The exact moment is when love stops passing through the ego. If we strip away all the signs, all the labels, all the longing, all the spiritual language, all the years of waiting, all the interpretations, and all the outer stories, we arrive at one core truth. The exact moment twin flames reunite is the moment love stops passing through the ego. That is the deepest explanation. Not the message. Not the eye contact. Not the physical return. Not the first conversation after silence. Not even the visible confirmation that something has changed. Those things may matter. They may become part of the unfolding. They may serve as the outer expression of reunion. But the exact moment itself happens at a deeper level. It happens when love is no longer being filtered through fear, pride, control, projection, desperation, or the need to turn the other person into an answer for pain. That is the threshold. And almost nobody recognizes it at first, because the ego is incredibly skilled at disguising itself as love. The ego can say, "I just care so deeply," when beneath that is fear of abandonment. It can say, "I am honoring the connection," when beneath that is obsession. It can say, "I know this is sacred," when beneath that is a desperate need for certainty. It can say, "I am surrendering," while secretly still trying to manipulate timing through hope, interpretation, or inner pressure. This is why the twin flame journey becomes so spiritually ruthless. Because it does not allow love to stay mixed with distortion forever. Sooner or later, everything false begins to surface. And what surfaces is not always easy to face. You begin to see how much of your love was entangled with wanting to be chosen. How much of your devotion was entangled with fear of being forgotten. How much of your longing was entangled with the hope that their return would finally settle the question of your worth. How much of your spiritual trust was still secretly asking the universe to reward suffering within. Outcome. These are painful realizations, because they reveal that even a real, sacred connection can still be experienced through the ego's architecture. An ego changes everything it touches. It does not necessarily destroy love, but it distorts it. It makes love heavier than it needs to be, more dramatic, more fearful, more exhausting, more conditional on signs, timing, and proof. The ego does not love in freedom. It loves with an agenda. It wants reassurance. It wants identity. It wants emotional security. It wants to protect itself from humiliation, rejection, and uncertainty. It wants to know how the story ends before it agrees to rest. And as long as love is moving through that machinery, reunion cannot fully become what it is meant to be. Why? Because then the connection is still being used. Used to regulate pain. Used to confirm identity. Used to repair old wounds from the outside. Used to create a future in which the self finally feels complete, important, or safe. That is not sacred union. That is love passing through the ego. And ego always turns even the holy into something unstable. This is the real reason why so many twin flame connections feel overwhelming for so long. Not only because the bond is intense, but because the bond awakens everything the ego built to survive. It awakens the fear of not being enough, the fear of losing control, the fear of being abandoned, the fear of surrender, the fear of not being chosen in the end. And when all of that rises, the ego tries to take over the journey. It tries to interpret every sign, control every meaning, predict every outcome, negotiate every silence, protect every wound. So even when love is present, the experience of it becomes filtered through self-protection. That filtering is what must eventually end. And when it begins to end, the exact moment draws near. Because the exact moment is not when the ego finally gets what it wants. It is when love no longer needs the ego's conditions in order to remain true. That is a radical shift. The ego says, love is real if I am chosen. The soul says, love is real when it is no longer distorted by the need to be chosen. The ego says, love is safe when I have proof. The soul says, love is free when it no longer depends on proof to remain true. The ego says, love means I must hold on tighter. The soul says, love becomes clear when control loosens. The ego says, reunion means the story finally favors me. The soul says, reunion begins when love no longer has to serve the story of the self. That is why this moment is so deep. Because it is not a reward for patience. It is a death of distortion. A death of the filters that kept the connection trapped inside pain. When love stops passing through the ego, something extraordinary happens. The other person is no longer just the symbol of everything missing in you. They are no longer the one who must return in order for your life to feel spiritually validated. They are no longer carrying the unbearable burden of being your completion, your rescue, your proof, your closure, your answer. For the first time, they become real again. Not less sacred, more real. And that reality is part of the reunion. Because ego loves the symbol of a person. Soul recognizes the truth of them. The ego wants the person to play a role in its survival. The soul wants to meet them beyond role. The ego says, complete me. The soul says, let me meet you from wholeness. That is the exact shift. And because it is an inner shift, it can happen before any visible event. You may notice that your need for certainty is weakening. Your obsession with timing is softening. Your emotional reactions are becoming less extreme. You still care deeply, but the care no longer feels like a wound trying to control the future. That is not emotional numbness. That is love becoming cleaner. And clean love feels very different from ego love. Ego love trembles. Clean love steadies. Ego love grasps. Clean love allows. Ego love interprets everything through, what does this mean about me? Clean love asks, what is true here without my fear distorting it? This is why the exact moment is often quieter than expected. Because when the ego stops filtering the bond, the emotional noise decreases. Less projection. Less panic. Less performance. Less need for the connection to constantly validate itself. And what remains is not emptiness. It is essence. The essence of the bond without all the suffering layered over it. That essence may feel simpler than fantasy. Less dramatic than longing. Less intoxicating than the old pattern. But it is infinitely more real. Because now, for the first time, love does not need suffering in order to feel sacred. That is the shocking truth. So many people unconsciously learn to associate pain with depth. The more it hurt, the more meaningful it seemed. The more they longed, the more spiritual it felt. The more intense the uncertainty. The more convinced they became that the bond must be extraordinary. But the soul eventually reveals something humbling. Pain was not the proof. Pain was the purification. The proof is what remains when pain no longer needs to dominate the way love is felt. And what remains is often quiet, direct, and deeply honest. It is not trying to win. It is not trying to prove. It is not trying to control the unfolding with spiritual language, emotional pressure, or idealized storylines. It simply knows. And that knowing is one of the clearest signs that the exact moment is already unfolding. Because once love stops passing through the ego, it no longer needs to be dramatic to be real. It no longer needs constant confirmation. It no longer needs the person to act in a certain way so the heart can breathe. It no longer needs reunion to come as a reward for suffering. Now love becomes something else. Not weaker. Wiser. Less entangled. Less symbolic. Less desperate. And from that place, the connection is finally able to be met without the old distortions constantly standing in the way. This is why the exact moment is not just romantic. It is spiritual maturity. The moment when the soul no longer asks love to serve the ego's wounds. The moment when the bond is no longer being translated through the old fears. The moment when two people can begin, at least in possibility, to recognize each other without so much interference from pride, pain, control, and projection. That is real reunion. Not because all wounds vanish instantly. Not because the journey suddenly becomes easy. Not because every outer circumstance resolves overnight. But because the deepest obstacle has begun to fall. Love is no longer being forced to travel through the false self. And once that happens, everything changes. The signs change. The silence changes. The meaning of contact changes. The meaning of absence changes. The inner atmosphere changes. Because the ego is no longer sitting on the throne, demanding that every movement answer its fears. Now the soul has room. Room to feel without distortion. Room to know without panic. Room to meet the other person as they are. Not only as the symbol of everything you once needed them to be. That is the moment. The exact moment. The moment love becomes stronger than egos need to possess, define, protect, and control it. The moment love no longer has to pass through fear in order to be recognized as real. The moment the bond is felt as truth, not as an emotional emergency. And that moment is deeper than any outward event could ever fully explain. Because once it happens, the whole journey changes meaning. It is no longer a desperate wait for reunion. It becomes the quiet recognition that the deepest part of reunion has already begun. Not in the outer story first, but in the place where all sacred love must begin. Beyond the ego, beyond the fear, beyond the old self. In truth. Send chapter 10, and I'll write the powerful ending plus inspirational message plus CTA to close the full video beautifully. Absolutely, here is chapter 10. Written as the powerful ending plus inspirational closing plus CTA in the same deep, emotionally layered YouTube narration style. Chapter 10, The Final Realization. the reunion you were waiting for was becoming true inside you. So now we arrive at the final realization. Not the kind that gives the ego every detail it wants. Not the kind that answers every question about timing, form, or outcome. Not the kind that says exactly when the message will come, when the meeting will happen, or how the story will unfold in the physical world. But the kind of realization that reaches deeper than prediction. The kind that changes the way you understand the entire journey. If you have followed this path closely, if you have felt the longing, the silence, the intensity, the collapse, the fear, the surrender, the inner death, the strange peace, the subtle shifts, the quiet truth rising underneath everything, then you may already sense what this final chapter is pointing to. The exact moment twin flames reunite is not the moment the world finally gives you what you wanted. It is the moment you become able to recognize love without needing it to arrive through suffering. That is the true threshold. And once you understand that, the entire story begins to look different. Because maybe reunion was never only about the return of a person. Maybe it was about the return of truth. Maybe it was about the moment your soul stopped asking fear to interpret love. Maybe it was about the moment your heart stopped begging pain to prove the bond was real. Maybe it was about the moment you no longer needed outer movement to tell you whether something sacred had already begun changing within. That is the real shift. And it is so much deeper than the fantasy version of reunion most people wait for. The fantasy says, one day, everything will suddenly make sense because they will come back. But the deeper truth says, one day, everything will begin making sense because you will no longer be relating to this connection through the old self. That is not a smaller miracle. It is a greater one. Because anyone can imagine reunion as an event. But not everyone is willing to understand reunion as transformation. And transformation is what this path has demanded from you all along. It has not only asked you to love. It has asked you to see. To see where fear entered love. To see where fantasy replaced truth. To see where longing became identity. To see where silence exposed wounds older than this connection. To see where you were still waiting for another soul to complete what your own soul was asking you. To reclaim from within. That is why this journey has felt so brutal at times. Because sacred love was never only touching your desire. It was touching your structure. The very structure of how you loved. How you attached. How you waited. How you feared. How you hoped. How you made meaning out of absence. How you turned pain into proof. And now, after all of that, you are standing in a very different place. Maybe not fully certain. Maybe not fully arrived in the outer sense. Maybe not holding every answer your human mind still wishes it had. But different. Quieter. Deeper. More honest. Less ruled by panic. Less intoxicated by fantasy. Less willing to confuse emotional suffering with spiritual truth. That difference matters. Because that difference is not random. It is the evidence. Not evidence that your ego can frame and display. Not evidence that can always be explained to other people. But evidence that the soul has already crossed into a new condition of being. A condition where reunion is no longer just something you wait for. It is something you begin embodying. That is the real mystery. The moment you stop needing love to save you is often the moment you become able to receive it. The moment you stop trying to control reunion is often the moment you become aligned with its truth. The moment you stop asking the outer world to resolve the war inside you is often the moment the deepest reunion begins. Not because the outer world no longer matters, but because it can finally become a reflection rather than a substitute. That is such an important distinction. For so long, maybe you wanted the outer reunion to substitute for inner certainty. To substitute for healing, for peace, for closure, for self-worth, for the end of confusion. But sacred union was never meant to become a replacement for your own becoming. It was meant to meet you there. And if that feels humbling, it is because truth usually is. Truth does not flatter the wounded self. It frees it. And freedom can feel very different from fantasy. Fantasy says, one day, I will finally be whole because love will return to me. Freedom says, I am becoming whole enough that if love returns, it will meet someone who no longer needs to disappear inside it. That is the final realization. That is the truest meaning of the exact moment. Not when you win the story. Not when pain gets rewarded. Not when the universe finally gives you an explanation grand enough to justify every wound. But when something in you becomes so true, so stripped, so honest, that love no longer has to arrive through distortion. That is sacred. And if you are in that place now, in the quiet stage, the surrendered stage, the honest stage, the stage where the old self is no longer functioning the same way, and the new self is not fully named yet, then hear this clearly. You are not lost. You are not behind. You are not necessarily being denied. You may be standing inside the deepest part of the reunion already. Even if the outer world is still catching up. Even if nothing dramatic has happened yet. Even if the story still feels unfinished on the surface. Even if part of you still aches, still wonders, still hopes. What matters now is not whether the old fantasy gets fulfilled exactly as imagined. What matters is that something real has begun replacing it. Something cleaner than obsession. Something wiser than longing. Something more grounded than emotional survival. Something more sacred than the pattern that once kept you in pain. That something is inner truth. And inner truth changes everything. It changes how you breathe. How you wait. How you love. How you listen. How you receive signs. How you interpret silence. How you understand the person. How you understand yourself. Most of all, it changes how you understand reunion. Because reunion is no longer just when they come back. Now it becomes when love no longer needs fear to be felt as real. When the soul no longer begs for proof. When the bond is no longer carried through old wounds. When the inner masculine and feminine stop living as strangers within you. When your heart can finally recognize sacred connection without turning it into a battlefield. That is the real moment. And once that moment begins, even if the outer world has not yet fully formed around it, the deepest part of the story has already changed. You are no longer waiting in the same way. You are no longer suffering in the same way. You are no longer loving in the same way. You are no longer asking the same questions from the same wounded place. That is not small. That is immense. Because the soul does not measure progress the way the ego does. The ego measures progress by events. The soul measures progress by truth. And truth has already done something to you. It has stripped you, softened you, broken you open, made you more honest, made you less able to pretend that fantasy is enough, made you less willing to use pain as the only language of devotion. That is what sacred love does. It does not only bring two people together, it makes them incapable of remaining false. And if that process has touched you deeply, then this journey has already done far more than give you something to hope for. It has made you into someone else. Someone who can feel without collapsing. Someone who can love without begging. Someone who can honor the bond without losing the self. Someone who can stand in uncertainty without turning mystery into punishment. That is who stands at the doorway of reunion. Not the self who only wants relief, but the self who has been made honest enough to receive truth. So maybe the question is no longer, when will the exact moment happen? Maybe the deeper question now is, can I recognize that the exact moment may already be unfolding in the way I have become able to love? That question changes everything. Because if the answer is yes, then what once felt like waiting may now become witnessing. Witnessing what is ending. Witnessing what is softening. Witnessing what no longer controls you. Witnessing the quiet emergence of a love no longer filtered through the old pain. And from that witnessing comes a different kind of trust. Not naive trust. Not forced optimism. Not spiritual performance. Real trust. The kind that says, I do not need to force this to know it matters. I do not need to dramatize this to know it is sacred. I do not need the old self to survive in order for the bond to remain true. I do not need reunion to happen as fantasy imagined for truth to already be moving. That is the final piece. Not the peace of having every answer, but the peace of no longer needing the old questions to rule you. And from that peace, something beautiful becomes possible. You stop relating to reunion as a future prize. You begin relating to it as a living truth that is already shaping you. A truth still unfolding, yes. Still mysterious, yes. Still unfinished in the outer world, perhaps. But real. Deeply real. So if this video has found you in the exact right moment, in the middle of your own silence, your own surrender, your own deep transformation, then let this be the message you take with you. The exact moment twin flames reunite is not always the moment the world announces it. Sometimes it is the moment the soul no longer needs the world to announce it at all. Sometimes it is the moment truth becomes stronger than fear. Sometimes it is the moment love becomes cleaner than longing. Sometimes it is the moment you realize that what you were waiting for outside of you has already begun becoming true within you. And once that happens, the journey is never the same again. Because you are no longer standing at the doorway as the old self. You are standing there as someone transformed. Someone quieter. Someone clearer. Someone less hungry for illusion. Someone more capable of reality. Someone more ready for sacred love than ever before. And that is why the exact moment matters so much. Not because it ends the story, but because it reveals the truest part of it. That reunion was never only about finding each other again. It was about becoming able to meet in truth. If this message found you at exactly the right time, write in the comments. I feel the inner reunion. And if you are walking the twin flame journey through deep transformation, spiritual awakening, inner union, and soul truth, subscribe to the channel, because here, we do not just talk about twin flames as fantasy. We talk about the psychology, the healing, the surrender, and the sacred inner shifts that make real reunion possible. And if this video spoke to something deep inside you, share it with someone who may still be waiting for a dramatic sign when in truth, the exact moment may already be unfolding quietly within them.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.